Hi, I'm James Hughes, the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and I'm talking to you from my office here at University of Massachusetts, Boston.
Hi, and I'm Regina Rini. I teach bioethics at New York University.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Regina is the author of a great essay in Eon magazine called Raising Good Robots that very nicely frames some of the issues in machine morality, and it was resonant for me because I recently participated in a week-long discussion of how to think about ethics for the future, and a lot of the discussion revolved around AI and machine ethics. And people kept saying that it was a very diverse group, and so not people familiar with moral philosophy, and so they kept saying, well, why don't we just define the common denominators of all human morality and code it into machines, and then we'll be done. And it's like, it's really a lot harder than that. So I like the way that you get away from some of the traditional categories, but you basically put your finger, so far as I understand it, I'm kind of throwing it back to you to see if I understood it right, that you were really putting your finger on the difference between having a kind of abstract set of ethical principles, which if we did, in fact, which we have a lot of, we have in human ethics, and so if we code any one of them into a machine, we could end up with a machine doing things that make a lot of us very uncomfortable, and versus the idea that ethics is more embodied and organic and a part of our mammalian primate neural architecture, which leads to a lot of uncomfortable and counterintuitive moral conclusions as well, the kind of is-ought dilemma. And you put some good fingers on the problems that might pose for machines. So is that basically where you were going with that?
Yeah, so you mentioned you were talking with folks about thinking about the ethics of future technology starting from the technology viewpoint instead of trying to perhaps oversimplify the ethics. And if anything, I might be coming in from the other direction, because I'm coming at this starting as an ethicist with some knowledge of the technology, but perhaps oversimplifying the technology. Hopefully right. Not, but acknowledge my limitations. So I'm starting from the viewpoint of ethical theory. And so what I'm thinking about are broad categorizations within philosophy of how we think about ethics. So you're referring to that kind of distinction. And the way I'm thinking about it is whether we think morality is a single set of absolutes. This is what I call the celestial view, where morality is out there beyond us. It's beyond human beings. It's beyond any particular sort of thinking agent. It's just there is one morality that's there eternally, and any thinking agent would eventually, hopefully, if it does well, figure it out. So that's one view. And this other view that I'm calling the organic view says that human morality is a function in some way of specific contingent facts about what humans are, what kind of biological entities we are, facts about our life course, things like that. And in philosophy, these two views are often in tension with one another. A lot of philosophers, Immanuel Kant is a famous example, think that morality is this celestial sort of thing. It doesn't matter who you are, what kind of reasoner you are, there is one set of moral principles, and the facts about humans are not that important. And then, of course, there's other philosophers who push in the other direction. And so that's my starting point, is these two different ways of thinking of morality. And what I was curious about does either of these starting points give us a productive way of thinking about how future artificial minds ought to be prepared to be moral? So right now, they're not. We don't have artificial intelligence that's clever enough for this to matter, but it's entirely possible it's coming, and it may be coming soon. And so I'm trying to think ahead of that. Once we start having advanced AI that can think for itself, can reason for itself, and possibly make choices for itself, how do we prepare for that? What is our what role do we have in inculcating a moral sense into it? So that's kind of the upshot of it. And I started off trying to think from these two different perspectives I mentioned. This celestial absolute morality on one hand, and the other this organic conception that says morality has to do with human nature on the other. And that's the starting point.
When I talk to people about these issues, I usually start by framing it in terms of the trolley problem kind of situation, where in one situation, you might be, many people are willing to sacrifice an individual to save many, as long as they don't have to personally kill the individual, as long as they can make some kind of abstract decision. And on the other hand, if they actually have to kill the person in order to save the many, many people balk at that and consider that an immoral choice. And I think what moral psychologists have been telling us about those kinds of situations is that the reason we balk at having to personally put our hands on somebody to kill them is that we have this kind of deep monkey brain morality, which we reason backwards towards. And so people like John Haidt argue that a lot of our morality is that kind of reasoning backwards to our intuitions. And people like Josh Green argue that it's precisely the value of the prefrontal cortex that we are able to suppress some of those intuitions and say, I'll use that one, but not that one. And that we train generals and sometimes great saints to be able to sacrifice individuals for the many. But in the case of machine morality, if you were just to program a machine to be utilitarian, the perfect warfighting machine, it would often make, it would often come up with conclusions like, well, just get rid of Cleveland then, because we'll save everybody else, and the rest of us will be. But on the other hand, we don't want machines being nepotistic or having all those failures of humanity, those intuitionist failures. And so I see people arguing both cases in the literature.
Yeah, so it's interesting to start with that example because the example is controversial in and of itself. So the kind of people you're talking about, especially the neuroscientist philosopher Joshua Green, think that the scientific findings show that not being willing to sacrifice the one, to push the one to their death to save the five in the footbridge version of the trolley dilemma, that shows we're irrational. I don't think he's right about that, actually, and a lot of philosophers don't think he's right about that. That it's not clear. I mean, we get a bit too far off on a tangent right now to talk about why, but a lot of philosophers doubt that he's right about that, even allowing for the scientific findings. It's possible that there could be this primate brain explanation for why we have certain intuitions. That doesn't necessarily mean the intuitions are wrong. Mm-hmm. And so we can have a normative ethical debate about what's the right answer. But if the problem here is if we're trying to think about how machines should respond to this kind of dilemma, and we humans already can't agree on what the correct answer is and what the scientific findings about our moral brains tell us, it's not clear we have an independent grip on what the machine should be doing. So you're right, probably most existing models of what an artificial mind would do here, some sort of maximizing or satisfying some sort of algorithmic approach, and in that case it's not going to distinguish between flipping a switch and pushing a person off a footbridge. But if you don't agree with the utilitarians, then the machine's making the wrong choice. And so we already have this problem here where we have to in a sense already know what the correct answer is to these questions we've been debating for millennia and don't have an answer to. So the question, are the robots making the right choice, is contingent upon this other question we don't know how to answer.
Well, the other thing I liked about your essay was that it comes back to this kind of obligation that we have to the moral psychology of our progeny that is cognate with the obligations that we have to our own children, that we have to basically raise them to be morally responsible, even if the machine minds come up with different conclusions from us and come up with different conclusions from each other. And I think that really is resonant with the way that I've been thinking as well. And I've been informed by this by Wallach and Allen's book, Moral Machines. They basically argue that for a machine to demonstrate what we would recognize as moral reasoning, moral sentiments, that it would have to go through the kind of character development process that human beings go through to have the complex of feelings. Yes, I will push the person to their death, but I will feel guilt about it forever. These kinds of existential dilemmas that we as humans would experience. And I like that because I think that is, in fact, the kind of developmental course that we will have to go through with them.
Yeah, that seems plausible to me. The tricky thing, though, is that machines aren't embodied, at least not yet. Not in AI is not embodied in the relevant way yet, and it's not clear we would ever want it to be in the way that we are. AI is not going to go through a sort of a childhood where its intellectual abilities and its physical abilities develop alongside one another in a somewhat yoked way. It's not going to make sense. It's not going to be efficient for us to have AI go through that sort of experience. And so I'm somewhat unsure of how well that's going to work, how well that would work, to require an AI to develop along that same sort of trajectory. Because you're right that would be the right way to approach it. That's kind of what we'd want, where there's this development where it's not just learning how to do the moral math, it's also learning how to react, to feel the same responses, or whatever the counterpart of feeling is for an AI. But how to get there, how the developmental pathway works, it's not clear we know how that could happen. It's not good models.
I think you're right that our anticipations about how AI is going to be is intensely anthropocentric, because we're the only example that we have of this stuff, and we go through moral stages where first we're capable of pain, but we don't have a self, and then we develop a self, and eventually we develop something that we all recognize as moral, responsible decision making. And machines could go through entirely, they could have all of that disaggregated. You could have the moral decision making without the selfhood and the pain, or you could have the pain without the other things. And it would be disembodied. It may be impossible to have a self, to have a personhood without a physical embodiment, because it's central to our development of it. So I think all of that shows that the space of possible AI minds is much more diverse than we imagine.
Or even just thinking about the idea of being a single self. So to the extent that we're in science fiction, we like to imagine there's one AI. There's this one super powerful computer we're talking to. But much more plausibly, if we get to the point where we all have our own little AI on our phones. So Siri eventually becomes advanced intelligence, and we now each have essentially duplicates, at least in their start state. Millions and millions of duplicates of the same AI, but as it comes to, in some way, I don't necessarily want to say be self-conscious, because that might be importing too many concepts here, but in some way to think of itself as an actor or an agent that can be held responsible, and that's crucial to be moral. Something that can be held responsible, there's a really tricky question there where if it is aware of the facts, and it's aware that it's just one of millions of duplicates of the exact same thing with the same start state, that's not how humans work. We don't have that. So it's not even clear what the sense of self and moral agency and being held accountable, if that's even compatible. I don't know. I'm sort of, you can hear I'm grasping for metaphors because I don't really know how to think about this. Well,
you were at Oxford, which is the global headquarters for worrying about Terminator robots stomping on the planet. And one of the problems I have with the folks who tend to argue that way is that they jump past this question of why in the heck would we ever want to create robots that were self-willed in the first place? It's like, what's the market for a refrigerator that argues with you about whether it's going to feed you food or not? Everybody from the military to the driverless car, everybody wants a machine that does what it's told to do, not that makes decisions on its own because of its own desires. So the fact that, I think that's, one set of questions is that AI ethics should really start with, what does it mean to create really powerful tools that do things in the world that are actually, the agent is a human being or a human institution that wants to do something with that tool, and that tool just happens to be really powerful.
Yeah, so we can think about it kind of like a continuum here. That there are cases where the AI itself is not capable of general reasoning. It's maybe not. It can do lots of calculations, but it can't figure out its own goals. It gets its goals fixed for it, input for it on a case-by-case basis by an institution, by its programmer, whatever, by someone else. And then the question really comes down to the ethics of the institution or the person, just sharpened by the increased power given by the computational ability of the AI. And I think those cases we have a relatively stable grip on, because they're comparable to, say, the ethics of nuclear weapons or of information technology, even as we have it right now, being able to do data mining and worrying about privacy. We kind of have a sense of the way technology can increase the power of existing agents. What I'm interested in but not sure how to address is once we have this new type of moral agent. See, you asked, like, why would we want our refrigerators to argue with us? Probably our refrigerators won't. But weapon systems, at a certain point, someone's going to be tempted to start giving them autonomy. And that means they're going to need to have relative autonomy. That is, we don't have to wait for every single drone to wait for some operator back there to decide every single one of its actions. Someone eventually is going to start giving them a certain amount of ability to make choices on their own. And at that point, they need judgment of some sort. And it's that kind of thinking that's going to get us down the way to wanting some systems to be able to make their own choices. And once we get there, it seems to me eventually, if it's possible, I don't know if it's possible, but if it's possible for an AI to be able to make its own decisions, then we're headed that way. So I maybe not our refrigerators, but I think if it's possible, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm not sure that judgment gets us to the moral complexities of an embodied personhood that I worry about, because I think you could imagine programming a pretty sophisticated rules of war following robot that would refuse to obey immoral orders, but because it was programmed to do so, not because it suddenly has an epiphany on the battlefield that,
Maybe.
killing is wrong or something.
Yeah, but what about this is related to an example I used in the piece. What about a battlefield medic robot that has to make decisions not about who to kill, where we want to have very, very, very firm guidelines we're not going to let a machine go past, but rather these more delicate and minute decisions about who to save, or about how to do triage and like how to prioritize which set of battlefield patients to attend to, that sort of thing that requires, I don't think we have precise rules for guiding that sort of thing. And we'd want an independent robo-medic to have some guidance on how to make those judgments. So an example I use in the piece has to do with amputating limbs. There are some people, maybe this isn't going to happen on the battlefield, but if we think about doctors in civil society, a robo-medic that's responsible for deciding whether or not to amputate limbs has to know why some people might be willing to risk very severe illness rather than, say, have the hand they play the piano with amputated. And it's a sort of thing where we don't have one-size-fits-all rules about that. It requires judgment. So I think we kind of have to make a choice. Either we just never allow machines to be able to act autonomously in judgment-requiring enterprises, or we have to think about how to imbue them with judgment and what kind of moral agency they have at that point. And so it's the latter side of the dilemma that I'm interested in, partly because I think eventually we're just going to do it. The efficiency, the savings for us, if we can have relatively autonomous machines making judgments on our behalf, we're just going to let them do it at some point, I imagine. So that's what I don't know when, I don't know how, but that's what I'm trying to think through. So you sound maybe still skeptical that might not be the case, that we might not allow them to do this.
I have a couple things in my head right now. One is that, Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, he basically doesn't care whether robots ever have personhood, self-awareness, those kinds of things. He basically just says if it's going to be super powerful and we give it certain kinds of missions, that it may, if we had a battlefield robot that was really smart and powerful, even if it didn't have desires of its own, and you said save as many lives as possible, then it might start, doing weird amputations, as you say, and it might do something that we would find really disgusting and counterproductive. And so we have to kind of control those things in the future. But I think that's just basically an extrapolation of we should make responsibly use and anticipate the consequences of our tools. What I find more interesting is what happens when these other parts of our psychology begin to be manifest in sophisticated machines, perhaps in these totally disaggregated and disembodied ways. And so the three thresholds that I usually talk about are pain and self-awareness, and then moral responsibility. Yeah. Anders Sandberg's written a great essay about how it would be irresponsible to create machines that could experience pain on the same grounds that we have rules for not causing unnecessary pain in animal laboratories. And which I think is a really, most people would find that very counterintuitive. First conceptualizing what machine pain might be like, right. But pain is essentially that an organism wants to do something and it's stopped. It doesn't want to be hurt and it's hurt. So there's desire there. And so I have a kind of Buddhist inflected view of it, that for us to really imagine a true independent AI personality, we have to imagine the development of the illusion of self and desire before we get there.
Yeah, and related to that, some people, when they talk about safety for AI, talk about implementing in terms of desires or proxy for desires, however you want to render it in AI speak, or basically certain strict limits of what an AI can do, or keeping human beings from suffering or whatever, are implemented as fixed desires of the AI. So we already kind of have that way of thinking, even if we don't care about the AI itself. People already start thinking that way. And so
but the problem I have with that is if you program desire into something from the beginning, it's not that different from the tool versus the self-aware, self-determining being. But the flip side of that is, aren't we programmed with desire as well? Everything that we talk about in the machines, we could say, but isn't that true of us too?
Yeah, where you can say, although there's a continuum. So we recognize among human beings a distinction between your civic upbringing, say your high school civics class, or even before that, your elementary school history class, where you learn about the virtues of your country, etc. We recognize that's one thing, and we can have a discussion about that, but that's not the same thing as brainwashing a captive prisoner, where you subject someone to psychological torture and eventually take advantage of their identification with their captor and force them to recite ideological doctrine, et cetera, et cetera. There's a way in which somebody who's been brainwashed in that sense, we really do kind of see the resulting choices as driven into them, which we don't see normal human beings who've just had a few years of school. And so I think we recognize that continuum. And so what you're pointing to is that there's one way in which machines that are pre-programmed are really far along that continuum. They're even past the brainwashing. And I think that point is beyond, how do I want to put this? If they are that far beyond being able to respond competently to their desires, they probably can't make judgments. And if we want them to be able to make judgments, to not be like fixed by these absolute rules, then they're going to have to be some steps back from that. So we want them to have desires in a sense, but it can't be this absolute overriding desire.
You seem to be imbuing making judgment with something I don't understand. I mean, for you, what is making a judgment that's different from simply following a decision heuristic?
So making a judgment involves at least two orders of thinking. So there's the initial inclination, it seems right to me to do this, and then there's at least a second order response to that. Is this in fact the right thing to do? Why do I think this is the right thing to do? What reasons can I give to myself or to other people for why this would be the right thing to do? And do those reasons make sense altogether? And so I think that making a judgment or providing a justification requires being aware that one is making the judgment and at a second order affirming what you're doing. And so I take it that if we're just imagining artificial intelligence that is following strict, hard-coded requirements, it's not actually making judgments when it does that.
Well, so it's like you say in your essay, the condition is that they must be able to give intelligible reasons for what they're doing. So you're implying a certain kind of metacognition that's necessary for them to actually make judgments. How many human beings actually exhibit moral metacognition?
It's a good question to ask, but I actually think that most people do. So so the psychologist Jonathan Haidt has put a lot of pressure on this with these very famous experiments on what he calls moral dumbfounding, where people give their intuitive responses to moral dilemmas, and you can demonstrate in these experiments that people insist upon their original judgment even when the reasons they give for them are taken away. And so there's some grounds for skepticism about our ability to give reasons for some moral judgments, but I think that's actually somewhat artificial. The kind of cases where that comes up are somewhat artificial. In our day-to-day life, we can pretty easily give justifications for what we're doing. So just think about where you're disagreeing with somebody about, say, you a second or third cousin's kid is having their graduation party. You don't know them that well. You'd really rather go spend the day with your friends instead, but you're disagreeing with your family whether or not you really are obligated to go. And you can give reasons like, well, they came to our kid's graduation 15 years ago and we should reciprocate, etc. Just very, very conventional day-to-day stuff. I don't think we're confabulating. I don't think we're doing the kind of thing Height's worried about when we do that. We actually are explaining to each other why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm not as much of a skeptic. I think most of us can, in ordinary circumstances, provide reasons for what we're doing.
Well, that's a generous view. I certainly know a lot of people who would be skeptical about the ordinary person's capacity. But of course, we're in the post-Trump era, so we're skeptical about a lot of things right now.
Yeah.
What do you think about the question of moral thresholds for the consideration of AIs as moral subjects, right? There's the consequences of AI on the world, moral agents, but AI as moral subjects. Where would you place these different kinds of thresholds?
Yes, I haven't thought as much about that end of it. And I think what you were suggesting earlier, thinking about, you have to remind me now, it was
pain, self-awareness, and moral responsibility.
That's what I thought. Okay, yeah, right, and that kind of meshes with some philosophical criteria for moral status when we think about animals or about early developing human fetuses, things like that. The kind of places where we have arguments for what has moral status already.
The personhood debates around abortion and
exactly
brain
right.
death.
Yeah, exactly. So those are reasonable points to ask, and I don't have a very distinctive view about this, except that for the same reason we have trouble with certain types of living things, say spiders, I think we're going to have similar problems with AI, where we're just not entirely sure whether or not the thing is manifesting any sense of pain, or whether or not it is self-aware, or even whether or not it is appropriately morally responsible. I add the word appropriately because I imagine if we start having AIs making life or death decisions, we're going to really want to hold them morally responsible. I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, but I'm thinking about, say, medieval Europeans who would have trials of animals that killed people, where you're so mad at the horse that kicked your uncle and killed him that you're going to execute the horse as punishment. I can imagine us getting to a point where we're mad at AIs getting people killed, so we destroy the AI purportedly as a punishment, when in fact it's not clear that it actually is morally responsible in any interesting sense. So anyway, I added the word appropriately just to, assume we have some criteria for what counts as morally responsible action. We may not know whether or not the AI actually does meet that criteria, and we're not just mad at it. So anyway, I'm not directly answering your question, except that I'm worried about this epistemic question of how, even if we know what the criteria for moral status or moral subjectivity are, we may not know how to apply them to AI, just as I don't think we really know how to apply them to insects, where we don't really understand how their minds work. So
I wrote a book a while ago called Citizen Cyborg, where I tried to pull together the different kinds of personhood debates in bioethics into a schema that used these three thresholds. And it kind of hand-waved at how we would be able to apply these to things like machine minds. And as I acknowledge, I think the situation is going to be far more complicated because they're not going to be developing linearly, they're going to be disembodied and so forth. But to the extent that we can, I think we should try to test for some of these things. And one of the folks who has recently given me some hope, although it's still a totally controversial theory, that we may be able to get away from the anthropocentrism of our views around this, is a guy named Tononi, who's got the integrated information theory of consciousness. And it's basically kind of mathematical extrapolation that if we could figure out how mathematically complicated or informationally complicated different kinds of minds are, that then we could get away from just looking at for this particular neural architecture and find minds in any situation. And then, of course, we would have to say, well, okay, this mind's as complicated as this one, but does this one do any of the same things or feel any of the same things or have any of the same qualia and internal states that this one over here does? That's going to be an open question, but at least we would be able to say, like a dolphin. A dolphin can't recognize itself in a mirror or can't talk to us, but it may be just as much a person and a moral decision maker as we are. We just don't recognize it.
Yeah, so there's a tricky thing there about consciousness, and this is sort of for viewers and listeners to make sure everybody sort of knows the way we're approaching this. It's helpful to draw a distinction that a lot of philosophers use. It goes to the philosopher Ned Block between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness.
Okay, I don't know about that.
Okay, cool. So yeah. So access consciousness is the kind of information integration you're talking about. Access consciousness is just that pieces of information are globally available to all information-consuming systems. So an AI could definitely be access conscious in the sense that or rather, certain information states of the AI could be access conscious in the sense that they're available globally to all bits of the AI. They can be used by all information consumption. But phenomenal consciousness, as Block draws the distinction, is the qualia. It's the what it's like. It's the experiential state. And it's at least conceptually possible, philosophers debate this, but it's at least conceptually possible that those two things come apart. That human beings are both. Human beings have both access to phenomenal consciousness, but it's at least conceptually possible there could be entities that have one but not the other. So the famous philosopher Zombie is one that could have access consciousness, in that it has representations of the world that it can consume in all of its information processing systems for moving about and talking and the like, but there's nothing it's like to be a zombie. There's nothing going on in the head. And so what I'm wondering about is whether AI is going to be like that. It could be access conscious, but there might be nothing it's like to be an AI, and that I think is an interesting gap with biological entities for the following reason. There's a pretty good argument to think that most biological entities have some form of phenomenal consciousness, and that has to do with the fact that we share an evolutionary heritage with them. And it would just seem bizarre to think that our phenomenal consciousness just appeared at some point along the evolutionary tree and wasn't back further. I mean, it's not clear where to draw the line here, but it's pretty unlikely that we're the first species that ever had phenomenal experience. It's pretty likely that's older than we are. But for an artificial entity that doesn't have a biological origin, that same argument doesn't apply. It's not necessarily clear that a very, very smart, access-conscious AI is going to be phenomenally conscious at all. So I mean, I don't know.
I agree, with the intuition that a philosophical zombie robot could be possible, that perfectly mimics personhood. Yeah. The problem I have with the argument is that we have the same epistemic difficulty with accessing that machine mind's internal states as we do with accessing one another's internal states. And the argument for denying the internal validity of other beings' internal states among humans has led to really terrible consequences. So, we've kind of evolved socially to the point where we just give everybody the benefit of the doubt that we're all basically the same.
But so think about this. Suppose there was a philosophical zombie that's a creature that appears to be human. It's fleshy. It's biological. It's not a machine, but there is actually nothing it's like to be this thing. So it has no experiences. It has no conscious feelings. Sorry, I'm careful with the word feelings here. It doesn't see in the way we do. It doesn't have the what it's likeness. Would it be wrong to pinch the philosophical zombie? It doesn't feel pain.
Right.
It'll say to you, "Don't pinch me." It'll even say, "Ouch." Because it's an exact functional duplicate of us. It will react in the same way we do, but by stipulation, it doesn't feel pain. So is it actually wrong to pinch the zombie?
Exactly. Well, that gets back to where I think these ethical thresholds are, pain and self-awareness and so forth. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the research at MIT, I guess it was, where they did experiments with people. They showed them a dinosaur that they if you held it upside down, it would say, put me back right side up. And then they gave him a hammer and said, now smash the dinosaur, and people would want to do it. So they were attributing personhood to something which clearly did not have it.
Right.
And that is as much a moral mistake as not giving personhood to something which actually does, right? Just as
is it as much a moral mistake? Because you might think that we want to err on one side or the other. We might want to err on being overly capacious in allowing things, for the reason you mentioned before. There's a history of denying moral status to human beings when we refuse to acknowledge them as fellow persons. And given that, we might want to just say we should err on the side of including anyone we're tempted to include. Do you want to say that?
I think I guess
dinosaur, but we'll include it anyway.
I get, I guess your argument's right that it's not as much of a moral mistake, but I think it is still. It's like saying we don't want to kill anybody in a hospital who's actually alive, but to keep somebody in the ICU who's actually dead is a moral mistake. I mean, you're wasting resources. You're taking something away from people who could really use it. Well, I do take seriously both the question of whether treating machine minds, even if they're not conscious, badly, however that's defined, might lead us to treat other human beings badly. That's one question, an empirical one, and it's like the video game debate, et cetera, et cetera. But then the second question is, given this difficulty of knowing what's really going on inside machine minds, should we make the error in favor of them being moral subjects? And I take both of those seriously.
Yeah, and I think the second question is the more interesting one in that there's an historical analogy here, which is how Kant, the Prussian philosopher I mentioned earlier from the 18th century, how Kant thought about animals. So Kant talks about animal suffering, and he's of the view that animals don't count as moral subjects at all. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with beating your dog. However, doing that can cause you to acquire these dispositions, these characterological traits that make you insensitive to human suffering. And so it might cause you to start hurting people because you get used to hitting things. And most contemporary philosophers looking at this don't find that to be a very satisfying argument. That's not the only reason to avoid beating your dog. There's also your dog's own moral status, its own standing, which might not be the same as people, but certainly you shouldn't just hurt dogs for no good reason. So you're pointing out the same kind of arguments about robots, and it might be true that empirically ignoring the suffering of AI will lead us to ignore human suffering, and that's indirectly a bad thing to do. But for the same reason that Kant's argument is not sufficient, we might think that that's actually not sufficient when it comes to artificial minds either, that we should care about them for their own sake. But then we're back at the question we've been pushing back and forth the last few minutes, which is, do we really know whether there's anything it's like to be a robot? And maybe does that matter? Maybe this is a way of bringing the question back around to the kind of criteria you were thinking about. So I asked if it's okay if it's wrong to pinch the philosophical zombie who doesn't have phenomenal experience, but does have a functional organization like us, and so functionally is set up to try to avoid being pinched. Is it wrong to pinch an entity that is functionally set up to avoid being pinched, but doesn't actually feel anything when you pinch it? In your view, what do you think?
I think no. I mean, this is like the fish pain. Certainly there are nerve sensory experience that goes from their nerves someplace in their body, but they don't experience it as suffering in their brain in the same way that we do, I hope, because I like fish.
I don't know if we know.
we just don't know, but that's the right question, I think.
Right.
You can have a robot that's set up to avoid being pinched, and yet it doesn't suffer, and therefore there's no problem with pinching it. But of course, people's reactions to seeing those. I think it was the Boston iRobotics robots that walk around like big dogs or donkeys or something, and people were kicking them and trying to push them over, and there were horrified reactions online. So, our animal brain moral psychology reacts to these non-sentient AI robots or whatever they are in a very primal way that, it may be that we're way erring on the other side, not becoming cruel at all.
Yeah, so one question is, why does it matter if we're erring? So one way it might matter is if we think it's important to always get things right in and of itself, the sort of perfectionist streak. I'm not so concerned about that. I don't think that's a very good reason to restrict it. But a much better reason is the cost reason you're talking about. So keeping a dead body in the ICU wastes resources that could be used to save someone else's life. Literally,
Right.
the space in the ICU might not be available to somebody who could still be saved. So if there are trade-offs, and it's a question about how the empirical situations work out, but if there are trade-offs, it might be that an AI that successfully mimics human responses but actually doesn't have any experiences, might be protecting that at the cost of saving the lives of human beings who actually can experience suffering.
And I think that's the right question. And it reminds me that soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan have gotten very attached to their bomb sniffing robots, and when these IED sniffing robots or bomb diffusing robots get blown up, they'll sometimes put them back together and send them for repair and say, we want our robot back. We want Fred back, not some other robot, just Fred. Now, if they really begin to imbue Fred with that kind of personhood, how many Freds is worth an actual human being's life, And I would say no amount of Freds is worth an actual human being's life.
That's really interesting. That's really, I hadn't heard of that before. That's really interesting. So I wonder, has anyone asked them, like, would you risk your life and the lives of your fellow soldiers to try to retrieve Fred? If Fred's damaged but not destroyed, and you'd have to expose yourself to enemy fire to retrieve Fred, the other option is to leave and abandon Fred permanently. Would you ever risk yourself? Does anyone ask them that?
I don't think so, and I suppose they're probably still too primitive to really engender that much camaraderie. But you could certainly imagine that when you get like Data on the Starship Enterprise, I'm sure his teammates, crewmates would be willing to sacrifice themselves for Data, and we don't know if Data is a philosophical zombie or not. So
yeah,
well,
that's interesting.
These are great questions, and of course in your bailiwick. But it seems like we do have to address the Elon Musk, Nick Bostrom elephant in the room, which isn't the big moral question whether we should be going down this road at all, since it's going to end up in stomping us all to nothingness. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know. I don't think it can be stopped. I think it's inevitable. I think that without like an incredibly implausibly effective world government, I don't think there's any way to stop it. Even if the United States were to effectively prohibit the development of extremely advanced AI, someone else will develop it. Maybe even if like all of the responsible governments in the world band together, then North Korea is going to develop it. Someone's going to do it. So I'm sympathetic to the thought that maybe we shouldn't, but I think it's going to happen. It's the same way if you asked me if I could have understood what nuclear weapons were in 1890, and you asked me should we develop nuclear weapons, I think that would have been the same correct response. We probably shouldn't develop them, but we're going to.
Yeah, and I think that's the right analogy. I mean, I definitely believe in the desirability of arms control, and I think that eventually, we hopefully will get to a point where we'll have transnational governance strong enough to prevent catastrophic risks. We're certainly not there now. And, our interventions in Iraq and North Korea and Iran to try to just stop nuclear weapons, which are relatively detectable, shows how difficult it's going to be when it's bioterrorism and AI and nanotechnology and these other kinds of catastrophic risks. So, yeah, I think there's plenty of reasons to be anxious about it from that point of view. And I think, thinking in that direction, one of the ways it can lead is to say, if that's going to be the case, if we're going to live, and Nick Bostrom talks about this in Superintelligence, if we're going to live in a world in which this is impossible to stop, then maybe we should be trying to come up with the best possible versions of these things in a kind of prophylactic way. So that, and I think that we're already seeing that. These netbot attacks, these malware attacks, the way that we respond to that is that we have a kind of global immune system now of artificial intelligence, which recognizes these attacks, develops the responses, pushes them out to everybody, and it's kind of our global AI immune system. So I think that that's the kind of direction I'm thinking about, that we will live in a world of multipolar, increasingly powerful AI, and hopefully it will continue to be imbued with and reflect human desires and accountability.
Yeah, but then there's an interesting question about what I'm trying to figure out the right words here. I want to be neutral in how I describe this. What it believes itself to be doing, or how it conceives of its own project. So, like, there's one way in which it is taking account of human sensitivities and human vulnerabilities as something like a zookeeper, right? Where the zookeeper is charged with taking care of the animals in the zoo. Maybe a nature preserve is even better, or a wildlife sanctuary, right? So where it's not even about displaying the animals, it's about their own well-being, but the custodian of these animals isn't necessarily identifying with them. And so and it makes a difference to questions about who do you sacrifice when you're forced to make sacrificial choices. How do you weight different entities' well-being against others? Basically, the question I'm trying to get at is, does the AI think of us as primitive beings under its purview, or does it identify itself with us in some way, where it's something like it's a person just much, much smarter, and so it's one of us, or are we something it's taking care of? That's a very imprecisely formulated set of questions, but it seems important.
Yeah, in science fiction, rather, this question of superintelligence and the singularity has really, according to many science fiction authors, ruined the whole project, because it's very difficult to think about and to describe what it would be like to be a character that any of us human beings want to read about in a world which has gone through that kind of a filter, unless you kind of project that we are, as you say, just kind of humored remnants and relics, on a curio shelf of the super intelligent beings. And, even my favorite authors like Ian Banks, who writes a great post-capitalist, set of space opera, the AIs are there in the background, but there's no explanation about why they put up with us or help do anything for us. Just what's the point for them, Yeah. So I think that you've got your finger on the right question.
Yeah, if you want to see an interesting example of this, sort of a not the normal science fiction source, but the British novelist David Mitchell, in the novel Ghost Ridden, which was published maybe about 12, 13 years ago. I don't want to give away exactly why this is relevant, but eventually it emerges that there is an artificial intelligence in that novel. And he's a very, very good writer. And so the way he's exploring the internal psychology of the AI alongside the internal psychology of some more familiar minds, it's really, really striking. And so it's the best example I've seen in print of thinking about what it would be like to be making these choices on behalf of humans, with human interests in mind, but not identifying with humans.
I guess my personal kind of futurism is I think the possibility of it turning us into paperclips is more likely than it keeping us around as a curio. But I think the optimistic scenario that I take most seriously is the kind of Kurzweilian one, that we enhance our own intelligence, connect ourselves to nano-machine interfaces, and begin to become, a part of this global consciousness with AI. But hope that's not going to be all of us. There's going to be great questions of inequality, who gets on top, even within that, those humans who are a part of that project. So that's a lot of what I've been working on with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies is these questions of equality, because it seems like those will establish the parameters for how many of these things play out, whether if they never become conscious, how they're going to be used as tools, who's going to be hurt, whether there's going to be algorithmic discrimination and legal sentencing and so forth. And then if they do become conscious and we start to be connected to them, who's going to be on top in that scenario? Which human beings are going to be advantaged versus others?
Well, so I don't know how to. This is going to be a tough question to formulate, but I think I'm really interested to hear what you think about it, because it involves thinking about our relationship to future humans as mediated through, say, human AI hybrids that will develop between us, or maybe just the AIs. And here's the way I'm thinking about it. Once AI is able to interact with us, even give all of the good assumptions, assume that it works well, assume that it's reasonable, nothing goes wrong. We figure out how to solve a lot of the problems we're talking about. But once it can interact with us, it can provide feedback into human morality, how human morality develops. And if we sort of teach it right now, as it's developing, to hold fast to certain moral beliefs, then it's going to give us feedback and constrain us from changing those beliefs. And so this has the weird consequence that we may be right now able to decide the direction of human morality 100 years from now in a way that we definitely wouldn't want the Victorians to have been able to decide for us right now. So I that seems like a very distinct problem that human beings haven't had before. So,
I think that's a wonderful speculation. I've been trying to write a second book about the moral enhancement debate. And I've found the kind of should we take oxytocin, shouldn't we take oxytocin aspect of it, completely irrelevant, because there's so many more things to talk about. And one of the things that hasn't been really addressed is the way that if we begin to code various kinds of human moral decision-making and sentiments into machines and use that to advise human behavior, just simple examples are, telling your email tool that if you use a curse word that it should hold on to that email for like 10 minutes before it sends it, and ask if you really want to use that word, something like that, which, Bill Maher could have used on TV last week, those kind of internal moral sensors.
Yeah.
But yes, as those become more powerful and as our brains get connected to these kinds of tools, then we will be basically codifying and reifying our own morality and keeping ourselves from drifting. Now, on the one hand, that means that we'll be a higher version of ourselves because we won't be the animals that we were before. But as you say, we wouldn't then, develop new aesthetic tastes or whatever, new moral sensibilities, which...
Well, yeah, if the sexual morality of a century ago had this kind of artificial feedback, we may
zap me every time I think about a dude.
Yeah, and exactly. We may never have had the kind of sexual liberation of the 20th century, and I mean, we can imagine counterparts. One of the things I think about as an ethicist are what are the things right now that are taboos that most of us have, or many of us have ethical objections to, but our descendants almost certainly won't. So an example I suspect is true is polyamory, where many people today still, even if they want to be supportive of their friends who might be in polyamorous relationships, still internally feel a sort of ick about it.
Which is weird because it's probably one of the oldest of human behaviors. Mammalian behaviors.
So suppose it's the case that left to our own devices, a century from now, polyamory would come to be ethically accepted. And just one of the many options people have for how they put together their romantic lives. But if right now people who find that ick factor get in the position of being able to teach AI what proper relationships look like and hard code a preference for monogamy into them, and those machines have a role in raising the next generation of human children through what's shown on television or virtual reality or whatever, then we may end up not getting to the place we would have otherwise gotten to.
On the other hand, you remind me of the last episode in Accelerando, Charlie Strauss's novel about a post-singularity evolution. And the kids in that last scene are in a post-mortality world. And as soon as they die, they are instantly recreated. And so their playtime in that scene is torturing, dismembering, and murdering one another. That's for them just going out and, being on the swing set is they have some really gruesome fun. And then for dinner time, they're all right back where they need to be. And, that I guess is back to our discussion about, is it wrong if you're not actually hurting or killing anybody,
right.
blah, 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 But, I think there are ways. Nick Bostrom, again, someone who's thought about all these kinds of things at one point or another, his essay on existential risks, one of the existential risks that he proposes is that we might willy-nilly evolve as a society into something that we would never recognize as something that we would want to be a descendant of the human race. And so, on the one hand, you're right. I'm sure my ancestors would look on me with horror and disdain.
Yep.
But do I necessarily want to create descendants that look upon me with horror and disdain? Do I have an obligation to do so? And
right,
and if I can avoid it, why shouldn't I?
Yeah, so I think we do have that obligation to, this is temporarily setting aside the entire question of AI, just thinking about affecting future human generations. I think we do have an obligation to pull back and not try to overly constrain the way that future generations develop. So this is even setting AI aside, other forms of technology make this more salient, where we might be able to, through gene editing and very effective epigenetic science, we might be able to constrain the moral developmental trajectory of future generations through their biology. And again, I don't think we should be doing that either. There are lots of reasons for that, but the most important one, I think, has to do with the idea of moral autonomy or agency, that we don't want to leave our thumbprint really heavily on the consciousness and conscience of people who won't even come into existence until a century after we're all gone. And I think that's true of humans, and I'm tempted to say it's true of AI as well, which is part of why I said in the piece that we have to think about them as a developing sort of progeny, our intellectual children, who we have to have a back and forth with. We shouldn't just try to hardwire into them certain reactions.
Okay,
people are going to disagree about this, but I really think
but I think you bring us back to the beginning of the discussion, because if I start up an earth-moving machine, and it goes and knocks down somebody's house, and then you say, well, why didn't you stop it? And I say, I didn't want to interfere with its moral autonomy.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it didn't have any moral autonomy, right?
Yeah.
So I think, with the question of AI, with human modification, I agree with you. I think we all have, at least today, we all share the intuition that we have moral subjectivity, our descendants will have moral subjectivity, and we probably shouldn't put our authoritarian boot print on it. But I think we really need to figure out this question of whether machines have what we think they need in order for us to respect their autonomy. And I don't know how we're going to know that.
Yeah, so what's interesting here is this is where those two types of consciousness come apart. The phenomenal consciousness that the zombie lacks, and then this access consciousness that a zombie could have, or the kind of functional organization that resembles global awareness of representations, that idea. And how we understand what autonomy is actually kind of tricky here. So it might be that the phenomenal zombie is autonomous in the relevant sense. Since it's a functional duplicate of us, it has, here we're treading on some really, 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 really deep metaphysical questions about free will and things like that, but plausibly, the phenomenal zombie has just as much agency over what it does as we do, even though it doesn't have experiences, because it's a functional duplicate of us. And our agency, our control of what we do, is a functional feature of us rather than an experiential feature. That's right. Controversial, but it's plausible.
Well, it appeals to my deconstructive Buddhist sensibility, which is, oh, you think you're a person? Show me. How do you know? Well, maybe if you take a good look, you'll find out you actually aren't. And again, yes, this kind of assumption, the naive psychology that we all have, that there's some little person, homunculus, sitting inside our head making free will decisions and imbued with, soul-like being. And when actually it's just a bunch of modules that kind of evolve over time, and memory isn't memory, and self isn't self, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you reflect all that back on us, it's like, well, maybe we aren't going to be that different after all.
Yeah, although many of us don't want to think about ourselves that way, and we therefore extend that courtesy to others too. That's why we regard it generally as really bad to manipulate other people. It's generally not acceptable to manipulate other adults. And even though it might be true that we are all just clanking collections of modules, still we don't think it's okay to manipulate other collections of modules because we don't want our own to be manipulated. So yeah, the phenomenal zombie may be just in the same boat as we are. And anyway, that's a way of saying we don't have to settle the question of experience, conscious experience and qualia. We don't have to know whether or not AI can have that to know whether or not AI could have something resembling this functional implementation of agency. And in that case, that's a reason to worry about putting our boot on their decision making.
Well, I think this is fascinating, and as I said, I'm working on two projects which basically touch on this question. One is the Moral Enhancement Project, something that I've been calling Cyborg Buddha, and part of it is this question of creating, compassionate robots or fair robots or good decision-making robots that then could help us become better people, and then what implications that would have for us being the kind of people that we think we should be. Whether it disarticulates the human sense of self if we start changing our moral capacities and our desires and our sentiments and so forth. And then the other aspect is the kind of political dimension of it, and trying to think about what a set of public policies that don't assume this, that we're going to have either nothing or Terminator robots, and government can't do anything about Terminator robots, and inequality will be irrelevant because of Terminator robots. What's in between? It's like, technological unemployment, algorithmic discrimination. There's lots of kind of AI questions that have to do with actual human politics and power in the meantime. Well, what kinds of things are you working on? It sounds like this is really your domain, moral psychology now.
Yeah, so I am. The kind of work I'm doing is kind of spread out at the moment, working on different things. And actually, this piece on robot ethics was a sort of a digression. It's not even part of any of the main things I'm working on right now, except that this thing we were talking about a couple minutes ago about thinking about future humans and whether or not we should put our thumb on their development. That's really close to the kinds of things. So I do a lot of work on moral cognition, about the cognitive science of morality, and I'm especially interested in the concept of moral agency and what we can learn about the science of human moral decision making. And so I'm part of this is theoretical, but part of it's practical, because we really are facing these nearer term questions about whether or not we should deliberately shape the moral development of future human beings. It might be that the kind of AI we're talking about might never happen, or if it does happen, it may still be distant enough in the future that we currently alive can't do much about it. But the genetic technology is very close. I mean, it's very plausible that many of us still alive will see a day when the kind of thing I'm thinking about can be done, where we can use gene editing and epigenetic science to greatly shape the moral development of future humans. And that's the kind of thing that I think we really have to think about in terms of moral agency. What sort of changes can we make to human development that still preserve the agency of the people who don't exist yet? And I don't have good answers to that, but it's something I think about a lot, and where I think that these theoretical questions about moral cognition really become practical.
Just parenthetically, although I was Buddhist from teenage years, I always considered virtue ethics to be a kind of conservative Catholic plot, and argued for a utilitarian interpretation of Buddhist ethics for many years, and that was reflected in my first book, Citizen Cyborg. And then I started to teach a course on happiness and public policy, and began to realize through teaching that course how naive my understanding of happiness was, given the whole Aristotelian versus everything else debate, and that's really led to this kind of character development, virtue perspective on not only the project of moral enhancement for human beings, which I think is just at its the discussion's really at its infancy, but also for, as I said, for robots. So perhaps we should come back and have a conversation about moral enhancement and the future of human moral capacities, because I think that would be fascinating.
I would definitely like to do that.
Yeah, great. Again, this is Jay Hughes from the IET, Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and University of Massachusetts, Boston. And thanks for the conversation, Regina.
And I'm, again, Regina Rini at New York University Center for Bioethics. And thanks very much, James. It was a lot of fun.